This is Carl Truman. Okay, so I guess we're going to, for the next 9 weeks or so in Sunday school, at least the 9 lessons, we're going to do 9 lessons, Carl Truman's book, Strange New World. This is an abridged version of The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. I think both books are great. I read both of them several times. But anyway, so, well, I'm going to let Truman speak for himself. He'll tell us what's going on.
How did the world arrive at its current state of cultural, social, and political flux, where identity politics seems to carry all before it, and nothing seems to stay the same for very long? Well, over this series of 9 lectures, I hope to explore the various institutions, philosophies, technologies that help to shape the intuitions of the modern mindset, that help to shape the nature of the modern self, that not only inhabits, but has actually created the world in which we find ourselves. Please join me as on this course we discuss the thinking of men such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud, as we reflect upon the tensions in modern identity politics as represented by figures such as Germaine Greer, and above all as we reflect on how we might respond as Christians to the culture in which we find ourselves, how we might think biblically in the midst of a world that is increasingly hostile to biblical ideas, how we might be voices of truth in the wilderness. Many of you will be aware of the book by Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, which is his story of a dystopian future for humanity. When you see the title of my book, Strange New World, it should be fairly obvious that I'm playing on Aldous Huxley's title. Except my book is not addressing the future. My book is addressing the world in which we now find ourselves. Many of us who grew up in, say, the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, find the world in which we now live to be a strange and alien one to that which we experienced as children. Even our children today might experience the world as strange to that which they knew just a couple of years ago. It seems very hard to believe, for example, that a mere 15 years ago, equivocating on gay marriage could have been electoral suicide at the polls in the United States of America. And yet now, any objections to something such as transgenderism could finish a career in public life. We live in a strange new world, and what I want to think about is why and how is that world so strange? And there are a number of things I think that contribute to that. First of all, and perhaps most difficult to articulate, is the incredible feeling of speed and change that many of us have about the environment in which we live. So little today seems to be constant. Everything seems to be constantly changing in a state of flux. Things that were certain just yesterday are being denied today. Why is it that the world in which we live gives us this feeling of vertigo, of dizziness, as we try to find something that might give us some level of continuity between yesterday, today, and tomorrow? The speed of change is dramatic and is frightening. Secondly, many of us have noticed over the last few years that everything in our world has become political. The old days where we would have organizations like, say, the Boy Scouts, or the local church, or the Girl Guides, or the Women's Institute, some organizations that didn't have a strongly political dimension to them, seem to have disappeared. Everything is now political. You may notice, for example, during Pride Month, how many big corporations in America sent you emails, if you're on their emailing list, assuring you of their support for Pride Month, assuring you of their support for various social and political causes. That's strange. It's strange, isn't it, that an institution like Amazon that just sells stuff goes out of its way to tell you how politically engaged it is. And it's disturbing, because it increasingly means that everything we say and do is subjected to political scrutiny. Everything we say and do identifies us somehow in the public square and makes us vulnerable to criticism. And we might connect to that the other strange thing that many of us are experiencing in the world today, and that is the collapse of the distinction between the public and the private. I remember growing up in Britain in the 1980s, and there was a clear distinction between public life, what one did, say, at work or at school, and what one did in the home. The latter was private, it was secret, only family members knew about it. And yet now we live in a world where the public and the private are increasingly blurred. The boundary between them has become increasingly dissolved, so that opinions you hold, even opinions that you express in a private context, may have public consequences for you. You might find yourself in trouble for something that you said you thought in a completely private and personal context, but which comes back to haunt you. And then there's the issue of sex. Isn't it strange how sex, once considered a very private activity between two individuals, has become one of the most pressing public issues of our day? And isn't it strange how sex has come to dominate our notions of identity, has come to grip the imagination? Think of the acronym LGBTQ. Think of what that says about the way we think of ourselves. It means that we've come to identify our sexual desires with who we are at a very deep and foundational level. Perhaps some of you have had the heartbreak of a child or a relative coming to you and saying, we think we're gay or we think we're bi. And they may never have had a sexual experience. But the very fact they experience certain desires deeply shapes how they think of themselves and how they think of their identity. And what I suggest in my book, and what I want to tease out in these lectures and in the study guide, is that underlying all of these things is the sense of the human self. There is something that binds together the chaos of our current world. There is something that provides unity and coherence to the way we experience the apparent chaos and change and flux around us. And that's the changing notion of the human self. Today we tend to think of the self as self-creating. We tend to think of the self as unhinged from any constant thing around us, and rooted entirely in our self-consciousness. We might put it this way. In times past, when you'd ask somebody who they were, they might have told you they were the son of somebody, or they belonged to a certain nation. They did a certain job. They belonged to a certain family. They would have described themselves, we might say, in terms of their obligations to and dependence upon other people. The way we think of ourselves today is very often as autonomous, as free-floating, as determining ourselves. And that can be a very attractive idea in some ways, because it plays to our intuitions of freedom. It plays to our desire to be free to determine who we are in and of ourselves. And yet when you think about it, when you extrapolate that to your view of life as a whole, it's also a very frightening prospect, because it means the only constant thing in this world is you. And that everything else that exists sort of exists in a kind of adversarial relationship to you. And then when you throw into the mix things like technology that profoundly shape the way we experience the world on a day-to-day basis, and the way technology is constantly changing and therefore constantly reshaping that experience, that can be very worrying and profoundly disorienting. And what I want you to think about at this point is how that contrasts with the biblical teaching of self. What I mean by self here is not the understanding that you're you and I'm me. I mean an understanding of what it means to be a human being, how we find our identity, how we find our purpose in life, how we find our meaning. Contrast the independent, free-floating self of today with the teaching of the Bible. Think about human beings made in the image of God. Think about how the identity of Adam and Eve was actually grounded in something external to themselves. It was grounded in God. It was grounded in his image. Think about that statement where God looks down and he sees Adam all on his own and he thinks that it's not good for Adam to be alone. What is God saying there? Is he perhaps saying that Adam only finds his completion and fulfillment when he stands in relation to another one of his own kind who is the same but different in an interesting and significant way? Think about the way the biblical narrative develops the account of humanity. Think about human beings, particularly the people of Israel, when God brings his law to them, when God gives them his commands. Right at the heart of those commands is that the people of Israel are to be hospitable. To be hospitable to who to? To their neighbours, to the sojourner, to the stranger in the midst. Why are they to do that? It's because God is a hospitable God. In other words, God is defining human beings at all levels as those who are dependent upon and have obligations to others. So one of the things I want you to do at the end of this first lecture is to think about that. Think about how you think about yourself. Think about how you think about job satisfaction, how you think about your family, how you think about your relationship to others, and ask yourself, how much of that modern understanding of the self that places me at the centre, makes me independent, that makes me self-defining, stands at odds with the basic definitions of selfhood and the basic history of selfhood that we find in the biblical narrative of the people of God, made in God's image and ultimately redeemed in the Lord Jesus Christ.
That's the last one. We'll start out, I think they're all 10 minutes long. We'll start out each lesson with one of those. I highly encourage you to get the book. I think that this is one of the best books I've read in a long time. If you think of yourself as a really deep thinker, go ahead and get The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. But Strange New World is wonderful. I think you should all read it. Anyway.
What is Carl's background?
He is I think he's an OPC pastor. He is a professor at Grove City College. He's written a number of books. He's appeared on various lecture circuits and podcasts dealing with contemporary issues. He's probably one of my favorite writers, or favorite modern writers. All right. So in the intro to the book, Truman writes, the origins of this book lie in my curiosity about how and why a particular statement has become to be regarded as coherent and meaningful. I am a woman trapped in a man's body. You know, how would your grandparents, what would they have done if they heard that, if somebody walked up and said that to them, I am a woman trapped in a man's body? They would have had him committed. Like this is why Whitfield exists, right? And this is why we have state hospitals. Like this is insane. This is nonsensical. How would your kids and grandkids respond if somebody walked up and said that to them? Would it be with the same level of audacity, perplexity, or with the kid? Would your kid? Well, hopefully. But at the same time, your grandparents wouldn't even understood the statement, but your kids do. Like they know what that means. They might disagree with it. Hopefully, I really hope they disagree with it. They might think it's insane on a certain level, but that statement now makes sense to your kids. I mean, or to your grand. Say what now? It's more normalized. It's normalized. A statement that might have been held as absurd 30 years ago has now become meaningful in one way or another to the vast majority of our population. And to call it absurd or to deny its meaningfulness might very well lead to accusations against oneself as stupid or subjected to immoral or backwards notions that you are a phobic, you're a transphobe or a homophobe. A favorite trope for literature and movies, at least the kind I like reading and watching, is the main character discovering that they're trapped in a world that does not behave the way they would expect. You could think of Alice in Wonderland, or more recently, The Matrix. I think the writer of the Matrix is transgender. It's either the writer or the director, one or the other. The title of Truman's book, of course, is, as he said in the lecture, is a play off Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. If you haven't read Brave New World, that's one of those books you ought to read as well. It's somewhat disturbing, if not entertaining at times. In Brave New World, John the Savage, they have a reservation where they keep, these groups of people that they're living like in the old days. We think of like a Native American reservation. Well, they have reservations of people that might be somewhat like us, living like we are, where you have this Brave New World, this cityscape off that have reached enlightenment, and that the people living in this cityscape, that they go to watch these people that live like they grew up in the 20th or 19th century. In Brave New World, John the Savage is transported from the reservation to the city where the moral assumptions of the old world no longer apply. Marriage, family, motherhood, fatherhood, chastity, suffering, religion, and even deep personal attachments are treated as strange, obscene, or antisocial. John enters a world whose priorities are entertainment, sex, soma, the drug by which everybody's intoxicated, and of course social stability, a world where everything has been redefined around pleasure, psychological comfort, and social conditioning. The people around John cannot understand why anyone would have ever believed the old rules or lived by them to begin with, that they go out to the reservations to watch these people and to mock them. But the dystopian future which Huxley described seems more and more to be the situation that Christians in the West find themselves in today. We have stepped into the shoes of John the Savage and entered a place that does not behave according to common sense or to values that the vast majority of the human race has held to one degree or another since the beginning of time. And as the strange new world we find ourselves in is at least in part the culmination of Marxist thought. Marxism is a Christian heresy. It provides a counter-protology, a counter-account of origins, and a counter-eschatology, an account of final things and salvation in these final things. The world, the strange new world we find ourselves in is an anti-Christian or heretical Christian world. It is the eschaton of Marxist history, or in the process of becoming that eschaton. The strange new world is the antithesis of the Christian new world, or what we would typically call the new creation. And nothing of this strange world is welcome in our Christian new world. And in the foreword to this book, Ryan Anderson summarizes Truman's argument as the story of how the person became a self, the self became sexualized, and sex became politicized. Older Western and Christian anthropology understood the human person as encumbered, created by God, embedded in family and community, accountable to objective moral truth, and called to conform himself to reality. Modern anthropology, by contrast, treats the self as unencumbered, defined from within by feelings, desires, and personal authenticity. And I forgot to give y'all your handout. Let me see if I can print that out real quickly. Thank you, Davey. Let's see, about 20. All right, Davey, this should be printing. Thank you. Okay, so where was I? Today we live in a Western world where virtues that were held as unassailable 30 years ago are now subject or widely subjected to ridicule, perhaps, or that are even held today as not a virtue but a vice. And he referenced this in the lecture. Even when Obama was running for president, what was that, back in 2007, he was still saying, I believe marriage is between a man and a woman. He didn't dare publicly question that marriage was anything but a relationship between a man and a woman. But here we are today with gay married couples adopting children, and it is their right to adopt children. And apparently in some circles of Christians, something as disgusting as polygamy is now being considered as morally acceptable. Truman talks about how parents teaching their children's traditional views about sex are now met with incomprehension from their children, who have absorbed far different views from the culture around them. I think this course is going to cover a wide range of topics. Of course, sex and sexuality being one of the main ones. I think a lot of parents have this rather wild idea in their mind. They're going to start talking about sex with their kids once they hit 13. If 13 is the age in which you decide to begin that conversation, you were about 10 years too late. I really appreciate, I occasionally watch Cross-Politic. As I assume many of you in here do. I really appreciate David Shannon or Chocolate Knox on Cross-Politic, talking about when he was in elementary school, sitting around the other kids while they're talking about their wildly pornified, misguided views of sex, and he responds, well, that's not how it works at all. And then he explains it to them, and they respond, well, how do you know all this? Because my mom sat down and talked to me about it. Some surveys claim that the average age children in the U.S. are exposed to pornography is now something like 9 years old, as the average, 9 years old. Surveys say that 58% of kids who encounter it do so accidentally. Both Aaron and I can remember, sitting at the living room computer with our moms there, with us, accidentally stumbling across pornographic content on the internet. And we didn't have smartphones, tablets, or laptops all days like kids do today. It's never been easier for your kids to be exposed to pornography. I think some Christians have this wild notion, if they send their kids to private schools, that their kids are somehow magically sheltered from being exposed to sexual content from their peers. All it takes is one kid in the group being given unfettered access to evil by his parents by virtue of having a smartphone or tablet all the time. And I'm certain more than one set of parents in your child's classroom has given their sweet, innocent baby boy unfettered access to evil day after day. And they share what they learn from Pornhub to the rest of the group. From a very young age, your kids' view of sex and sexuality are being shaped by content from their peers, by stuff they find in popular media and stuff they come across personally on the internet. Your kids are being catechized about sexuality, and if you're not the ones teaching them, someone else is. Truman writes, what a parent considers to be a loving response to a child struggling with same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria might be regarded by the child as hateful and bigoted. And this is as true within the church as it is within wider society. The generation gap today is reflected not simply in fashion and music, but in attitudes and beliefs about some of the most basic aspects of human existence. The result is often confusion and sometimes even heartbreak, as many of the most brutal engagements in the culture war are played out around the dinner table and at family gatherings. Welcome to this strange new world. You may not like it, but it is where you live, and therefore it is important that you try to understand it. And so you might be thinking, oh, yes, sir.
When you say that, just thinking about my childhood and kids, generationally that were the same age, sex was almost taboo for a while, and, you talk about talking to your kids about it when they're 3 years old, right? You're 10 years too far behind, but the fact that it wasn't discussed kind of helped steer us in the way that we went culturally.
And C.S. Lewis talks about that. He says it goes back and forth. It goes from being taboo to being completely back in the open, and the pendulum just keeps swinging back and forth. And neither of these two extremes are healthy. We're looking for some middle ground. And again, Yeah, there's been all sorts of literature and literature written by conservative Christians about age-appropriate discussions of sex with your kids. One book, I should have written this down. One book was recently recommended to me to a Christian counselor. Is what does the conversation look like from 3 to adulthood? That is recommended. Every counselor I've ever talked to in the last 5 years has been suggesting that this ought to be done, along with not just recent counselors. This has been suggested for a long time. But yeah, it's there's this view in one sense, you sort of talking about maybe the Victorian view, or at least the perception of the Victorian view that sex is dirty. Well, that's not helpful either. That compromises, as children go up in adulthood into marriage, if they've been taught sex is dirty their whole life, that's going to cause some pretty significant problems in their marriage and their self-conception as well. Our goal is to teach a biblical view of sexuality. And the Bible, of course, has a lot to say about it. It's a sort of situational ethics. That you're trying to teach your children, you have unique bodies that are sexed as either male or female, and there's a goodness in this. And there's also a sacred in this, that your bodies were designed for specific purposes to perform specific tasks, ultimately to join together with somebody of the opposite sex and to form families and fulfill the dominion mandate given at creation through doing so. So we don't want to treat sex as either a taboo, neither do we want it to be a completely out in the open, all the time obsession. But there is some level that needs to be addressed. And again, it needs to be a biblical version of the narrative that we're addressing. I mean, the Bible has an entire book on sex, if you aren't aware. And of course, the Song of Songs was the most cited book in the Middle Ages. Bernard of Clairvaux was Calvin's favorite pastor. Clairvaux was long dead. He was also Martin Luther's favorite pastor of the Middle Ages. Bernard of Clairvaux gave something like 80 sermons on the Song of Solomon, and the only reason he didn't keep on going is because he died. But before he finished it, people, we think of people in the Middle Ages as being prudish. Well, that's not true. That they thought these issues were important and worth thinking about and discussing to an extent in a public context, even from the pulpit. Calvin wouldn't have had a problem with that. But again, but in reaction to the culture's overemphasis on sex and wrong emphasis on sex, some Christians have this idea, well, we just don't need to talk about it. Oh, that's not the right response. We need to give a Christian response in the Christian view. And in terms, you might be thinking, why are we talking about this at all in Sunday school? These intellectuals, the movements of culture, and shouldn't we be talking about the Bible? Why should we spend time understanding this pagan culture around us? Do we have any biblical precedents for trying to understand the pagan culture around us? Or biblical precedents in studying pagan authors? Do we have anybody in the Bible that quotes pagans? Positively even. The Apostle Paul, Acts 17, he goes to debate the Stoics and Epicureans on the Areopagus, or that means the Hill of Ares or Mars Hill in Athens. And Paul quotes something like 4 Stoic and Hellenistic thinkers from memory. Who all does he quote? He quotes Epimenides' poem Creatica, Cleanthes' hymn to Zeus. You think, oh, that's a little bit wild. Paul is quoting in him we live and move and have our being. That's Cleanthes. That's also quoted from Aratus's poem Phanomena, Phenomena. So we have Epimenides, Cleanthes, and Aratus. All these pagan thinkers sought to explain how their world worked, whether conceived in Stoic or Hellenistic terms. And Paul the Pharisee, Paul the Hebrew, could quote these pagans from memory, which means that he had read them and probably read them extensively. Apparently Paul's favorite pagan philosopher was Epimenides. He also quotes him in the letter to Titus. A prophet of their own has said, all Cretans are liars, and this statement is true. And that's that sort of goes over most people's head. That's a joke. That's an example of the liar's paradox. A Cretan has said Cretans always lie, and this is true. Well, if it's true that Cretans always lie, and the Cretan said that's false, but then it's true. That's a joke that Paul's telling, and I think it's sad that people no longer get the joke. But Paul understood if you're going to be in dialogue with non-Christians, and that's part of our jobs as Christians, is to be in dialogue with non-Christians. That's how you go about discipling the nations. That you got to understand where they're coming from. Paul read their best and brightest thinkers, people that were popular in his own day, though to some extent have been lost in our own. The only reason we know who these people are is because Paul quotes them. That's the only reason any of their work survived to the present, because early Christian monks, when they were transcribing these documents and deciding what to keep, they looked at some of these pagan writings and they said, oh, Paul quotes this, so we're gonna write this down and keep it from being burned in the fire. Paul uses these people's own words to confront their own worldview, to use Bonson's language, that the unbeliever provides the rope by which you will hang them. And so we ought to be concerned. We ought to think about what modern pagan or secular writers are saying about the world, especially since so much of our culture has gone right along with it. You know, a lot of the nonsense that our strange new world holds to so dearly was championed by people like Margaret Sanger. Does anybody in here know who Margaret Sanger was? She was the founder of Planned Parenthood. I mean, she is, this figurehead of modern feminism, the abortion movement, sexual liberation, and all these other, horrific things that disgust us so much. But again, most of our culture thinks she's wonderful. They have statues of this woman up in a lot of places. If you look at her Wikipedia, so just out of curiosity, I looked at her Wikipedia article, and she's presented as this great champion of racial justice in the African American community. And it has this brief section about eugenics, and oh yes, so she was a eugenicist, but it wasn't racial eugenics. This is just what everybody believed at the time. She was just a woman of her time, and so it's actually not bad. Well, that's the same argument people make about the Confederates and slave ownings, but we don't treat that as justifiable or good argument. But when they applied the same argument to Sanger, she was just a woman of her time. She couldn't help it. Margaret Sanger founded Planned Parenthood with the goal of killing black babies because she wanted a pure white race in America. And the Wikipedia article doesn't talk about any of that. It says the opposite. 65% of all abortions Planned Parenthood performed in 1921 were of ethnic minorities. 35.5% of all abortions in 1921 were black children. Sanger writes, birth control must ultimately lead to a cleaner race. In one letter in 1939, Sanger writes, we should hire 3 or 4 colored ministers, preferably with social services backgrounds and with engaging personalities. The most successful educational approach to the Negro is through a religious appeal. We don't want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. She wrote that in a private letter to one of our friends and colleagues. Liberals will mock the biblical and Christian writers as holding to backwards immoral notions, but when you start looking into the people that liberals hold forth as their own prophets, their own figureheads, you start finding things that are unimaginably abhorrent, even especially to modern liberals. The modern abortion movement is underpinned by the same exact philosophy that the Nazis used as justification for murdering 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. And people championing abortion have the audacity to call Christians monsters and Nazis for opposing it. Truman writes, welcome to this strange new world. You may not like it, but it is where you live, and therefore it is important that you try to understand it. Knowing what the architects of this strange new world wrote and believed is going to be helpful for you as you attempt to evangelize the people of this strange new world. Essentially every conservative Christian book I've ever read that talks about intellectuals, they all start talking about Rousseau, and they all cite the same sort of specific things that Rousseau was doing. It's because every one of these authors has read Paul Johnson's book Intellectuals, and Rousseau is the first chapter of that book. So I'm rereading Intellectuals right now. That's a great one. Rousseau is the figurehead of modern education and child rearing. Rousseau abandoned all of his 5 children to the orphanages, and I think probably all of them died in orphanages. It's not because he was poor, he was extraordinarily wealthy, but he said, having to raise, screaming brats would detract me from the greatness of my work and the gift I am providing to humanity. Rousseau was a nut job, and why is sport such a big deal in modern education? Like our whole society now revolves around children's sports, because Rousseau taught that the best way to raise your children, one of the essential ways to raise your children, is they need to be playing sports. And again, this person is considered the fountainhead of child rearing philosophy and education, and he abandoned all of his children, did not raise a single one of them. And then he had the audacity to write elsewhere, I would have been a wonderful father if I had taken the time to do so. Really. Anyways, Truman's arguments in this book is that as bizarre and random as the confusion of the modern world appears to be, there is something that unifies it all. He writes, this is the notion of the self, and the self connects to the 3 other concepts of relevance to my narrative: expressive individualism, the sexual revolution, and the social imaginary. Truman cites Robert Bellah in coining the term expressive individualism, and Charles Taylor for explaining how that concept has become normative for selfhood in the West. Those definitions and statements are in your handouts. Is there an extra copy of the handout by any chance? Okay, so expressive individualism. Expressive individualism holds that each person has a unique core of feeling and intuition that should unfold or be expressed if individuality is to be realized. The culture, and Taylor goes on to say, the culture of authenticity is one where each one of us has his or her own way of realizing our humanity, and that it is important to find and live out one's own as against surrendering to conformity with a model imposed on us from outside, by society or the previous generation or religious or political authority. We all determine who we are, and we shouldn't be listening to things like the Bible, our parents, generational norms, cultural norms, because that would mean I'm not living true to myself, and living true to myself is what ultimately matters. That is the modern view, that is the view that has taken our generation captive, is that of expressive individualism. In short, Truman writes, the modern self is one where authenticity is achieved by acting outwardly in accordance with one's inner feelings. And that's why it's become such a sensitive subject to criticize somebody for their lifestyle choices. It's not simply that you're criticizing their behavior, but you're now seen as attacking that individual in his freedom to be true to himself or herself or itself. And attacking their behavior, you are now seen as attacking them to their very core, because their behavior is a reflection of who they are or who they conceive themselves to be. Truman writes, it is my contention in this book that expressive individualism provides the broad backdrop to these aspects of what is commonly called the sexual revolution. So that brings us to the next point. What is the sexual revolution? Well, when people think of the sexual revolution, they conceive of it in terms of the ways in which sexual morality has been transformed since the 1960s, in which the range of socially acceptable behavior has been expanded. When your parents and grandparents were born, homosexuality was criminalized across most, or if not all, of the United States. Today, it's legal everywhere. It's legal by Supreme Court judgment. And such could be said, the same could be said about premarital sex or cohabitation. But Truman writes, he argues the sexual revolution should be conceived of in broader terms than of loosening of moral boundaries. He writes, what marks the modern sexual revolution out as distinctive is the way in which it has normalized sexual phenomena such as homosexuality and promiscuity, and even come to celebrate them. The sexual revolution is not that modern people engage in gay sex while earlier generations did not. It is that gay sex no longer involves stigma and has come to be regarded as normal. if not something to be celebrated. He writes, the sexual revolution does not simply represent a growth in the routine transgression of traditional sexual codes, or even a modest expansion of the boundaries of what is and is not acceptable sexual behavior. Not at all. Rather, it is the repudiation of the very idea of such codes in their entirety. If the individual's inner identity is defined by sexual desire, then he or she must be allowed to act out that desire in order to be an authentic person. And of course, we still have sexual codes. We still have laws, penalizing certain behavior and actions. Pedophilia, for instance, is still outlawed, even if it doesn't seem to be a priority of Trump's Justice Department. On paper, pedophilia is still held to be grossly wrong by even most people in our culture. But the reasons it's held to be wrong have changed. In the past, objective morality might have been appealed to. Today, it's not about intrinsic moral significance. Rather, it's about consent, or the ability to give consent, or the inability to give it. And as it turns out, and Truman's going to talk about this later in the book, making consent the boundary marker, making that the justification of not doing something or doing something, is a really, really bad idea, and that doesn't work the way that people think it does. Now to the next, I think the last point. Why do we think the way we do? How is it that expressive individualism has become the default mode by which Westerners understand themselves today? How is it that ideas promulgated in elitist circles by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Mary Wollstonecraft made their way into the mainstream? Truman is going to argue that intellectuals don't directly cause the rise of the modern self in a direct way. Rather, the views and beliefs of the intellectuals, he says, they capture important aspects of what he calls and others have called the social imaginary. They didn't just pull this stuff out of a vacuum. That Rousseau took something that was already present in culture, he refined it, then he regurgitated it, he released it back into the culture, and that process just sort of continues. The intellectuals are taking things people already believe, radicalizing them and sending them back to see whether or not they'll be accepted, and the process continues. Charles Taylor defines the social imaginary that intellectuals are interacting with as follows. I had the definition on your handout. I speak of imaginary because I'm talking about the way ordinary people imagine their surroundings. And this is often not expressed in theoretical terms. It is carried in images, stories, legends, etc. But it is also the case that theory is often the possession of a small minority, whereas what is interesting in the social imaginary is that it's shared by large groups of people, if not the whole society, which leads to a third difference. The social imaginary is that common understanding which makes possible common practices and a widely shared sense of legitimacy. So Taylor citing, what all does he cite here? He cites, it's expressed, it's carried through things like images, stories, and legends. So that's how, older cultures would have conceived and promoted and carried on these things. What would be the modern equivalent today? How is the imaginary shaped and formed and carried on and promulgated, if not through images, stories, and legends? Media. Media, whether you're pop culture, and anything from Facebook and TikTok reels to the sitcoms you watch, the movies you watch. They're all promoting a message. They're all promoting a certain view of reality that the modern man has just come to accept as normative. And again, if somebody, the Westminster Divines, the Westminster Confession says that Christians shouldn't watch stage plays, and they were aiming at Shakespeare, who was their contemporary. And again, your kids read Shakespeare in school. I don't know when the last time you read Shakespeare, but if you read Shakespeare, and again, what's good about it is that the language is so antiquated that people don't pick up on it. Shakespeare is really raunchy. I understand. If you ever watch a traditional replaying of it, the plays are really raunchy as well. And there was a reason the Westminster Divines said that they didn't think people should be watching Shakespeare. They thought that violated the Seventh Commandment. They would be flabbergasted to see modern media today and the sort of things that we present on sitcoms. Most of you probably watch something like Friends Just the sexual licentiousness in something like Friends, the cohabitation, the lifestyle choices. Even that seems mild compared to stuff today. 25 years or almost 30 years later. The massive shift there. But yeah, all these things are informing the way we think. We're just passively taking them in. And even if we don't accept the premise, like I said, your kids understand what it means if somebody says, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. They may not agree with it, but they get it because they're imaginary. The social imaginary is something that we all share. Even if we don't exactly agree with all of its conclusions, it allows us to understand and I guess to a degree empathize with the modern world. Truman writes, what Taylor is pointing out here is the fact that human beings do not typically think about themselves and the world they inhabit in consistently self-conscious terms. Rather, we imagine it to be a certain way, physically and indeed morally. Thus, for example, when I rise from my desk and go to the kitchen for a cup of tea during a break from writing, I do not spend time reflecting on the physics of solids and gases. Indeed, I have only a very minimal understanding of such. But I do leave my study via the hole called the doorway, and not through the walls. That is an intuitive action. Similarly, in the realm of morals, much of my response to the world around me is instinctive. If I see a person being mugged, I move to help them myself or by calling for assistance. I do not need to reflect upon Aristotelian or Kantian arguments about ethics. I simply react instinctively because I intuitively know both that the situation is wrong and what I need to do in response. The way we look at the world is rather intuitive, and it is not primarily driven by way of rational arguments based on principles or first principles. So the story of the modern self is the story of how we intuit or imagine the world based on a wide range of factors. The champions of the sexual revolution in the 60s, they're all reading a guy named Wilhelm Reich. He's the intellectual basis of their movement. Now Reich lived a good deal of time before the sexual revolution happened, and so why didn't Reich's writings immediately spark something like this and cause? Well, why do decades pass before something like this happens? Because what caused the social imaginary to shift in favor of such a movement? It was made possible by the advent of the pill. So that a cheap form of contraception is now available, exists to separate sex from procreation. And when Wilhelm Reich was first writing, that wasn't possible. But now it is through means of technology. Now it seems reasonable to separate the notion of sex from procreation. Then the messaging of Playboy and Cosmopolitan promoting promiscuity also seems reasonable. No-fault divorce seems reasonable. And the rhetoric of feminism of control over the body seems reasonable because it seems like now we can control the body and we can prevent the consequences of a promiscuous lifestyle. Think of something like transgenderism. There's always been transvestites. You just think if you've ever watched the TV series MASH, you have Klinger in MASH. He's cross-dressing to try to get out of the army. There's something interesting at some point, in there. I think a Swiss doctor comes along and meets them, and it's like we have procedures in Sweden now. I said Swiss, Sweden. We have procedures in Sweden now that can actually help you. And he says, what do you mean? We can rearrange your genitalia to bring you into conformity with what you believed. And he was like, oh my gosh, absolutely not. What are you, that's crazy. I'm just doing this to get out of the army. I don't actually believe that. That's insane. And so, and again, MASH is one of those TV series you go back and watch. It's like, oh, this is pretty progressive, all things considering. But even back in the 70s, they got a transvestite on TV. Even they think it's insane that somebody would surgically alter themselves to conform to something like that. But what makes transgenderism possible, or what makes the modern movement explode? Again, there's always been transvestites. The Emperor Nero was infamous for dressing like a woman. After his wife died, he took one of his male slaves that he thought looked like his wife. He married this male slave. Well, he castrated them first. But in the wedding ceremony, Nero dressed up as a woman. He was wearing the wedding dress. And again, we look at that and say that's wacko. And indeed, Nero was wacko. But the reason why such a movement can explode today, whereas in the past it was something that was sort of in the closet, always on the periphery, the key factor is that modern surgical techniques seem to offer a way to actually change your gender in a way, and again with the addition of hormone therapy, in a way that makes it appear to be viable. Like, we still know it's absurd, but it gives the illusion that this is possible, that you can actually change your gender, even if you can't alter your chromosomal structure, at least not yet. So Truman writes the following in conclusion: to anticipate my argument, it is my conviction that the dramatic changes in flux we witness and experience in society today are related to the rise to cultural normativity of the expressive individual self, particularly as expressed through the idioms of the sexual revolution, and the fact that the reasons for this are so deeply embedded in all aspects of our culture means that we are all, to some extent, complicit in what we see happening around us. To put it bluntly, we all share more or less the same social imaginary. Of course, the importance of the social imaginary points us to the fact that if our world has no simple, single cause, our problems, therefore, have no simple, single solution. The modern self is the fruit of a complicated confluence of cultural factors. That can be depressing for those who hope that electing the right politician or appointing the appropriate Supreme Court justice will solve all the world's ills. But it also means that we can begin to think more constructively about how to address the issues we face. And that is the hope I have in writing this book. I offer no easy answers, but I do hope it provides a framework by which the reader is better able to understand or be more self-conscious of the modern Western social imaginary that shapes us all. This is neither a lament nor a polemic. Both have their place, I am sure, but here my purpose is more descriptive and explanatory. To respond to our times, we must first understand our times. That is my goal. And with that having been said, let the story of the modern self begin. That's the lesson. Any questions or comments on that?
He goes through all the philosophy starting back at this. He was writing that, early 70s.
Oh, yeah.
Over 50 years ago. He was making the same point that.
And there's a lot of times you read Truman, I'm just sitting here thinking Rushdoony said the same thing 50 years ago.
Yeah, but basically, if you've ever heard the phrase tabula rasa, like we're all born as a blank slate, and it's our job to figure out who we are. That was a philosophical movement. I think it was Sartre, somewhere in that range, in the early 20th century. But that whole idea that do you determine your future? Well, that came from or finding the answers within yourself, or having to, came from that idea, and it appeared before that to some extent. But that's just something that's led even now to even sexual identity crisis, where you don't even know what you are because you haven't figured it out yet. Mm-hmm. It's pretty ridiculous.
It is. And yet, the issue, the broader issue, it's like, oh, you think, oh, this is a liberal issue. No, it's not. Conservatives believe the same sort of things. They teach the same sort of things. They just haven't taken it to the same conclusions. They haven't gone the same directions in terms of sexual revolution yet. But we're getting there. I mean, the Republican Party today, in terms of abortion, is where the Democratic Party was 30 years ago. Abortion should be safe, rare, should be safe. What was it? Safer and legal. That's where the Republicans are today. It should be allowed in some circumstances, but we want it to be rare. That's what Bill Clinton would have said 30 years ago. And so we're all moving in the same direction because we all have the same underlying social imaginary, and that has to be addressed and countered. It has to be addressed self-consciously. And we have. We could say another way of talking about this. We could use the language of worldview. There's probably a reason that Truman's avoiding that. I could speculate on that, but yeah, we have to be thinking about these things and self-consciously, changing the way we think about the world, and self-consciously teach a biblical worldview to our kids. So I think if you're going to read any modern book written by a living author, you ought to read this book. And you might think, oh well, things are changing in the 5 years. That there seems to be a backlash. I don't think the backlash is gonna last, especially if the Democrats win the next election. We're going to go right back into the full blown insanity. And again, these issues are not disappearing. They're just as prevalent as ever. You hope. He talks about, this is disappointing for people who think, oh, if I just elect the right politician or appoint the appropriate Supreme Court justice, it's going to fix all the world's problems. If the world's imaginary, if the world's worldview isn't changed, we're gonna keep ending back up in the same place. We got to address the underlying problem, not the symptoms. So I encourage you to read the Brave or Strange New World. You ought to read Brave New World too, but a Strange New World for this class. You can find it on Audible. Truman narrates it on Audible. So that, again, you all drive. A lot of you drive a fair distance for work. I think the book's only like 5 hours long on Audible. Individual chapters like 25 minutes or something. So you all ought to read it. You have no excuse not to read it. Any other thoughts? All right, let's close with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, help us to self-consciously reflect on your teachings, what you say that we are as human beings, how we are created, what we are created for, and how we were designed to function in our male and female identities as the completed picture of the image of God. Help us to understand what you believe and you would have us believe about these things so that we can in turn respond to this fallen world and its bizarre beliefs and anti-beliefs concerning these things. Help us to disciple the nations and help us to understand what the nations believe that we may better disciple them. It is in your Son Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.